Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here in my on my own actually, because Jonas and I tried about 5 times to start this video together, and for some reason my audio was just not working well. I don't know what was going on. Now you'd think that me recording on my own computer would be less problematic, but I'm not going through Discord this time, so we're fingers crossed that this works out. If you hear it, it worked out. Bummer that Jonas isn't going to be here to work on the video with me, but it's better than not getting it out on time, because I'm actually playing with Nick and friends tomorrow, and tonight I'm going to a random local wrestling thing, so it's just not going to work out if I don't do it now. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoy it anyway. I'm going to miss having Jonas, his input for this, but it is what it is. So guys, before we move on here, don't forget to share, like, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep that YouTube algorithm pumping, and come join us in the Discord. We're getting more and more people involved with the Strategoi project here to get all of these factions talked about as soon as we can when they come out, and hopefully you guys feel like we're adding something to the discussion that you're not seeing in your other favorite YouTube channels, so that we get an even more complete kind of image of what's actually going on. All right, let's get into the nitty gritty here. We've got our faction focus for Flesh Eater Courts. This is a weird one. Not the update itself, but where it sits in kind of a meta sense from kind of what GW has been doing with the books. Because as anyone that's paying attention knows, Flesh Eater Courts is the most recent battle tome, and considering that they first got their limited edition box with the limited edition version of the book, and then the rules didn't go legal until the red bordered standard edition box came out, our book came out, this army hasn't been getting a lot of tournament play, as much as you'd expect for its life cycle, and they waited quite a long time to get their third edition or updated rules. And then all of a sudden we're switching to an index. And I'm happy to report, if I had to say one thing about this, what they've shown us in the news article today, in contrast to what we've seen with the other, how many have we seen? 4 last week, 4 this week, not counting this one, and then I guess we could say Lumineth, so the other 9, is that this one is the most consistent with what its last set of rules was. In fact, it got a few nerfs here or there, but I think most FEC players are going to feel pretty comfortable with what's changed, especially knowing full well how hard the changes, especially for ogres, some of these factions have been, or the changes have been for these other factions. So let's get into it though. So coming down here, sorry, overscrolled. The battle traits. The way that FEC works nowadays in the new book is because they've got this delusion going on. They think they're good guys, and they're actually these crazy ghouls that are going around eating people. Whether they're aware of their position with Nagash and what they actually are, I think there's a few in the lore that are aware of what's going on. Like, I think Ushoran might be, but the average Flesh Eater Quartz guy is running around thinking he's a knight or a serf. And so they kind of rotate around this. All the rules spin around this noble deeds idea, where it's our first thing in the upper left-hand corner here. You're basically counting up for each one of your heroes how many noble deeds. It's like they're going on quests that they've accomplished, and you want to get up to 6. They can't hit more than 6. So there's a lot of kind of bean counting, as we call it, with this faction. Obviously, if you only brought one hero, you're only doing it with one hero, but this is an army that traditionally has wanted to play around a number of different heroes to get these buffs. Now, the way you collect them is you got 3 different main triggers here. The first one, I think they changed the order in which they're listed in the book, because the first one's probably the most likely to do it if the heroes are fighting, at least, which is when they use a fight ability, which could be any time that you get to engage. And fighting, of course, is combat, not shooting, but they're not really a shooting army anyway. So you're engaging in combat. That could be in your opponent's turn. That could be in your turn. Any amount of damage points you did are going to create noble deeds points. So they're extra encouraged to go get into combat and try to do some do some damage. Now, this does not count for the attacks made with their companion weapons. So a guy that's on a Royal Zombie Dragon is doing a lot of work with his mount, but that companion is not generating any of these noble deeds points. So it's literally the hero himself. The other two ways that you're generating are if you're a priest or you are a wizard, and that's for any prayer that goes off successfully, which, of course, there's no interaction with a prayer, so there's no unbinding equivalent to a prayer. So if that prayer goes off, that hero gets a noble deeds point. So obviously, if you could pray more than one prayer, which I don't know if they have any priests that can do that. We haven't seen all the new war scrolls yet, but traditionally that's not been the case. So they're getting max 1 from doing that. And then we've got the wizards. So if you had a 2-cast wizard and you got both of his spells off, then it's 1 per spell. Now here's the thing is they changed the wording just slightly here, where it used to say if it's successfully cast and not unbound, because in at least 3rd edition parlance, you had to kind of keep an eye out on what the wording was here. Successfully cast in 3rd edition ruling just means that you successfully rolled high enough to make the spell go off. That achieves the status of being successfully cast, but your opponent still has a chance to unbind it. So you could still have both things be true, that it doesn't go through, but it does count as successfully cast. Now, I have a feeling that the 4th edition core rules are going to just say, they're going to get rid of that distinction. The successfully cast means that it wasn't unbound. But if it still works the way it used to, then this is actually a buff for the army. I'm not expecting it to be a buff, so I wouldn't, hold your horses for or get your hopes up too high for this. But anyway, that's how this works. So you're trying to build all of these noble deeds points. Now, the rest of the things here, most of the rest of the things are actually interacting with those. But let's skip to the one that's not real quick. So this is actually new, and I don't know if it's actually a replacement for another rule. It's kind of a combination of maybe some little things here or there, but functionally, as far as I can tell, it's basically a new heroic action that affects all of the abhorrents in your army. It's once per turn army in your hero phase. So you're doing it 5 times per game, and you can pick any number of friendly abhorrents to be the target. So these are your better heroes, the higher level heroes, as far as I'm aware. They're not courtiers. They're the like Ushoran himself is an abhorrent. He might, let me check real quick. In the 3rd edition rules, is he also a courtier? No, he is just an abhorrent. So I don't know if anyone has both keywords, but I don't think so. All of them heal D3, which is good. It's, them drinking the blood and healing back up, because they are basically vampires. So this is a new ability. It's kind of cool. And then the rest of the abilities are surrounding the use of your noble deeds points. Now, the feeding frenzy one in the bottom left-hand corner is pretty much exactly the same thing it was before, where you're adding 1 to the tax characteristic of melee weapons, including those of companions, used by friendly flesh-eater courts units while they are wholly within 12 inches of any friendly heroes that have 6 noble deeds points. So they're capped out. So this is encouraging you not to spend those points, or only spend them if you know you're going to be able to get back up, or say you have more than one hero in the neighborhood, that you can have one, leave them on 6 noble deed points, and then have the other one storing up, and then have them trade off who is spending and who is keeping flat at 6. So adding 1 to the tax characteristic of melee weapons, including your companions, is pretty strong, and is something you want to take into account whenever you're looking at the war scrolls for these units, because they're very often getting up to +1 attack once you get this stuff rolling, this engine rolling. Now, the other 2 abilities are in your movement phase. Again, I don't know if it's just a core rule that all your movement phase abilities actually happen at the end of the movement phase, but I'm kind of getting that vibe, because both of these rules, if I'm not mistaken, used to say they happen at the end of your movement phase, and now it doesn't specify when, but we've seen, especially with that one Skaven versus Lumineth game, we've seen some things that seem to indicate that your movement phase abilities happen at the end. But I could be wrong about that. We just need to see the core rules. Let's assume it stays the same, and if you have more flexibility, then that's an upgrade, a slight upgrade. So we got Muster Guard and Summon Loyal Subjects. And one of them, the first, Muster Guard, centers around interacting with your Courtier's Noble Deeds points, and then Summon Loyal Subjects is around your Abhorrent's Noble Deeds points. So as far as I'm concerned, or aware, they don't overlap. But Muster Guard, you could do any number of times with each Courtier hero, I guess. It has 1 or more Noble Deeds points. And you spend either 1 or 2 of that hero's noble deeds points. If you spend 1, you return 1 slain model to a friendly serfs unit wholly within 12 inches. And if you spend 2, then you return 1 slain model to a friendly knights unit wholly within 12 inches. Now, the thing about this is that it actually got plus 2-inch movement, or not movement, but range on this, but it used to be within and not wholly. And so even though this looks like a buff, it's a nerf, a slight nerf, depending on how much you're trying to spread your units out. So those heroes are going to want to be near enough to these spread out serfs units that they can still constitute as being wholly within. And plus 2 inches is not making up for the kind of spreading out that we used to see. That said, in 4th edition we have half-inch coherency, which of course means that the units are implicitly going to be a little bit more tightly bound to each other instead of being spread out on a conga line, for example. Now, otherwise, I think this rule is pretty much the same. And there used to be a kind of caveat at the end of the rule that said you can use this ability multiple times each turn as long as the required noble deed points are available, meaning multiple times with that hero. So if that's still true, I definitely think you could do this with multiple heroes. Now, whether they can each use it multiple times per hero, that goes back to a core rules thing. I'm assuming that's probably the case, as long as they've got enough deed points to do it, but I don't know that for a fact. So we'll have to see. If they are limited to only doing once per hero, then it gets worse. But I have a feeling they can do it multiple times. And then Summon Loyal Subjects is the abhorrent version of this. So they have to have full 6 noble deeds points, and then they're blowing it to bring back a serfs or knights unit that's been destroyed. That's basically all of your units that have more than one model or fall into one of those 2 categories. They blow all of those deed points, but you make a new replacement unit with half the number of models rounding up that comes in wholly within 6 inches of battlefield edge and more than 9 inches from the opponent's stuff. I'm pretty sure this is exactly the same, but they did have a thing that said at the end of that you could bring back models as kind of an exception to this type of rule that we see in other places in other armies. You like, say you lost half your unit, then you could rally to bring them back up. But with most other armies, that wasn't the case. It was a new unit that was capped out at that top amount. So there's no mention of that here. I have a feeling that bringing back a replacement unit has its whole section in the core rules, and it's either going to say whether or not that's possible. So if it follows the same rules that most of the other armies do, then it got nerfed just a little bit there. But it's still a strong rule. So these are small distinctions that they don't really flesh out in the articles as far as I'm aware. So we're just going to have to wait and see. So that's what we have. And it's a full page of rules that are all interesting and have some flexibility. Now, there's always the question of what we might have lost. Well, one thing that was in the battle traits formerly was that all Flesh Eater Courts units had at least a 6+ ward. That's just been moved onto the War Scrolls like we saw with Night Haunt. So don't worry about that one. And then the other things that have been lost are the Courts of Delusion. This is definitely one of the bigger nerfs. Now, it's not entirely gone. We'll see that later, why I'm saying that. But it was 5 different things you chose in the first battle round, and they could be kind of obviously flexibly chosen then. They're not on your list, your list building step, so that you could adjust your army to what your opponent actually brought, who you're actually playing against. Those are gone unless you take Ushoran, and we'll come back to that in a bit. And even then, he doesn't have access to what used to be the strongest one, but I'll get back to that in a bit. And then we also had heroic actions and monstrous rampages. We do see one monster today that doesn't have the same one of the 2 monstrous rampages we used to see, so it could be that we just lose them entirely. And then the heroic actions, we don't have heroic actions anymore, but this ability that I mentioned down below, the Royal Blood, is kind of like a heroic action that applies to all of your abhorrents. So that's in a certain kind of way making up for that. Although heroic actions can be done every hero phase, and these are only in your hero phase. But ultimately, I think they've kept a lot of the really strong rules, and with the exception of getting rid of the Courts of Delusion, if you don't take Ushoran, I think they mainly came out unscathed with this set of new rules. So if I were a FEC player, I'd be okay with this, especially considering what other people have lost. Let's scroll down and look at some new stuff, though. So they always have a formation that comes after this one. So we're seeing the Ghoul Patrol, which sounds like Paw Patrol, a demented version of Paw Patrol for any of you parents out there or people that hang out with kids enough to know that Paw Patrol is a thing. So this one, it's a weird one. I don't know what Jonas or Nick would say about this, but they basically said you get the I forget what it's called, the quick reactions thing that Lumineth has, where you basically get to choose 2 units to fight instead of 1. But they've got a very limited set of units that can use this, because only Crypt ghouls can do that. Now, as long as neither of those units has the strike last effect applied to them at that moment, they both fight one after the other. Now, it really depends on how good Crypt ghouls are. I mean, this is your basic chaff unit. I don't know if this is actually that great, but, it seems okay. It's interesting. Considering what their sub-factions used to do, I feel like this is definitely a downgrade. But we don't know what the other 3 are, other than the description they have just below here that says we've got Cannibal Courts, where you get more noble deeds for being in enemy territory. Okay, interesting. Lords of the Manor allows you to, quote-unquote, rally more soldiers to the cause. Now, that sounds like you're using the rally ability, but I have a feeling they mean it loosely, as in you're just having better resurrection or recursion abilities. And then the Royal Menagerie, is bringing... it's focused on monsters that you're bringing, and they've got better speed. So maybe all of your monster builds are just faster, which we saw something kind of like this with the FEC 4 sub-factions that they had before. Not going to go into all of that because we'd need to see what these are, but we definitely did have a monster one before, which was the Gristlegore, which you'd just give it strike first. So it's not a 1-for-1 here, but obviously they're kind of applying some amount of splitting these up in a way that makes sense. Okay, let's take a look at one of our only other examples we've seen thus far of getting to see both the summoning card for a endless spell. This is a faction endless spell. The Corpse-mare Stampede, which is basically the horses. I think I'll scroll down so you can see what I'm talking about. These guys right here. It's like the undead horses they summon. And then also, of course, their Marrowscroll, which we're looking at here. But let's take a look at its summoning little Marrowscroll thing. It's summoned on a 7, casting value 7, assuming you don't have one on the field, but that's always the case with endless spells. Its setup range is holier than 9, and then outside of 9 of enemy units. This has changed a bit, but keep in mind that this is a formerly known as a predatory endless spell, and as such, they've just changed how those work entirely. So I wouldn't get too down about that. So then we've got the setup range, which is now holier than 9, and it used to be, if I'm not mistaken, holier than 3d6. And then it was also outside of 1 of all units. So this has changed quite a bit, but now it's outside of 9. So that's going to be a little different, but I think we're going to see that a lot with a lot of these endless spells. Okay, so let's scroll down and see what this is actually looking like once you get it on the field. So, as you're probably aware, if you've been following the news, predatory, or what used to be known as predatory moving endless spells, now have a kind of stats wheel with a health characteristic, a save characteristic, and pretty much always, I think, a ward. So you see that this has got 10 health, a 5+ save, and a 6+ ward. It's actually pretty tough for an endless spell. Now, if you weren't aware, you can now interact with endless spells as though they are enemy units. You can charge them, they can charge you, you can fight in the combat phase, maybe they've got a shooting profile, they have a movement characteristic, but they always kind of did as endless spells, and they have a different banishment value on here. So thus far, if I'm not mistaken, the 2 examples of summoned endless spell and its banishment value have been the same, but that doesn't mean that's always what we're going to see. Now keep in mind, when you summon it, you have to hit this or higher, and then your opponent has to not unbind it. But to banish it, what it used to be is if you saw a 7 here and then you tried to get rid of an endless spell, you had to roll higher than this. Well, now that means if the values are the same, then you actually got a +1 essentially on what it takes to get rid of it, because you used to have to roll an 8 and now you just have to roll a 7. But anyway, there are multiple ways to kill this. You could banish it, giving up one of your prayers or casts at some point, or you could attack it either through shooting or melee. Now it kind of wants to be in combat too because it actually has a weapon output here. So it's obviously with 10 health and then doing having a 5-up save, you've got to get 15 wounds worth of at 1 damage hits and wounds to go through on average. Well, actually a little bit more because of the ward, so another 20% more. Anyway, so it's a little bit more endurable than some of the other things we've seen. It's definitely more endurable than some of the terrain features we've seen, which is kind of interesting. So it kind of functions like a moving terrain piece that has to be set up outside of 9 inches. Now, it's got this effect here. It happens in your movement phase. Now, I'm not sure if this is separate from its movement characteristic. Like, I was under the impression that these types of endless spells, when they move, they work just like any other unit, where they've got a movement characteristic, and then they can charge later in the charge phase and all that stuff. But then it's got this movement phase ability, and it's called a core or move. So maybe you choose between doing this and doing a normal move. I don't know. But I don't know why you would choose not to do this ability, because it's basically better. So what it does is it moves up to its movement characteristic, and it can pass through models and the combat range of enemy units, but it cannot end that move in combat, so outside of 3 inches. Note that it also has the fly keyword, so it's basically replacing the normal move ability. So I guess this is subbing in, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the normal move ability says that you can, if you have the fly keyword, you can move over things, but if not, then it's just covered in the core rules somewhere else. But in addition to this, then it says pick up to 3 enemy units that this manifestation has passed across during that move to be the targets. Roll d3 for each target. On a 2-up, inflict an amount of mortal damage equal to that roll. And important, designer's note, this manifestation can use this ability even if it is in combat. Now, what does this mean? Well, say in the previous turn it charged and got into combat. Now it can basically do a kind of retreat, and it has to actually end outside of combat. So it's basically just a normal retreat, except it gets to trigger this ability on 3 different enemy units. Now, what did it used to do? It used to move over any number of units, and if I'm not mistaken, you got to do its ability against any number of enemy units that it moved over. Yeah, and of course it was moving in both people's phases, so if I'm not mistaken, it no longer moves in the enemy phase just freely. It's only it's one of your units. It's like it's got with its health characteristic and save characteristic and everything. It's like it's just a normal unit. And when it moved over those units, you had to roll greater than its wounds characteristic to do 1 mortal wound, and you'd be rolling 6 dice to do that. And for each 6, it does 1 mortal wound regardless of what its wounds characteristic was. So it was doing somewhere between, on average, 1 to 5 mortal wounds against a given unit. Now it's definitely doing less, but it depends on what their wounds characteristic was and how that works. But the cool thing is, it could have been in combat. It gets to get out of combat, go do this thing, and then gets to charge again, I'm pretty sure, later in that round, and maybe only 3 inches away from a target enemy. So I think it's actually got some cool interplay, and it's a cool model. So I'm happy to see it being used. And I think it probably will get used a little bit more than maybe it did before. So that's my thoughts on that. But I'm curious to see you FEC players out there, what your thoughts are of that updated War Scroll. And obviously you get a manifestation lore for free when you take this. You could take a generic one, but if you take the FEC one, then you're getting that plus the other 2 endless spells that they've got. All right, let's look at the big man himself, Ushoran. So this guy is a new model. It's one of the newer things that they've gotten added, and he is their Mortarch. So he's like the big bad daddy of FEC. So let's see how integral he is to playing the army now. And I'm going to say, spoiler alert, I think he's become much more necessary than he was recently. I think Nick has basically said he thinks Ushoran just gets shot off the table too easily and doesn't bring enough value. And I think with the way things have changed, especially losing what are they called? The Courts of Delusion, those abilities, that now that he's the only way to bring that he's going to be a little bit more auto take. So let's take a look at what has changed with Big Bad Ushoran. So as far as I'm aware, none of his stats wheel changed at all. He's still 16 health, 4+ save. If you scroll down here, he's still got a 5-up ward, still Wizard 2, still War Master, and Unique. All this looks the same. And if you look at his weapon profiles, he actually got better. He got +1 attack on his Scepter, which is basically making him always have, because the rest of the profile stayed the same, always have Feeding Frenzy, because that would give him +1 attack on that profile. So and then of course he could get Feeding Frenzy on top of that, which actually makes him quite punchy. And then for his Talons, it's a bracketed profile. It can bracket, but for his fixed profile, if he's not bracketed, it's as though he's on his second best profile before. So he lost 2 attacks on that. And then when it gets bracketed here, when he takes 10 or more wounds, it goes down to 6, which was equivalent to his second lowest profile. So now he's basically functioning at either his second best or second worst profile from what we used to have, which was at 3s and 3s -1, 2. And of course that can take Feeding Frenzy and go up to 9 or 7 attacks respectively. So that got nerfed a bit depending on how you look at it, but the fact that he can't ever go down to his lowest profile is definitely a kind of buff. He's got kind of compressed in there, if you want to see it that way. Now, his passive ability, the Carrion King, used to say that, well, it actually was the exact same rule, if I'm not mistaken. It made his Feeding Frenzy range, instead of being 12 inches holier than for units around him, now it's holier than 24. And he's on a big base, so that hasn't been nerfed at all. And then if we look over here to his Rampage, remember, if you want to see if something's a Rampage, it's down here, but it's good to know that they don't always happen in the charge phase, at the end of the charge phase like they do in 3rd edition. They could be, that's determined up here. And it's once per turn army, but I'm assuming he's the only one that has this Rampage, so that's kind of a given. So he can pick up to 3 enemy units in combat with him, so within 3 inches, to roll dice for each target, and if that roll exceeds the target's control characteristic, that the target unit has strike last for the rest of the turn. So let's talk about what this used to do and what it does now. But just to be clear about what it does now, this is the first time I think I've seen control characteristic written in the ability itself instead of something with control score. And I feel like they handled this poorly, but I like that they used it here better than they did with the Ogre Gluttons that we just saw in the last faction focus, the Ogre's faction focus. So your control characteristic is what you see in the wheel. Your control score is the combined amount of control characteristic values that your unit would have based off of how many models you have in that unit that are standing on that objective. And then usually when we see something that buffs your control characteristic, it means add all that stuff together and then add like +3 to the total, like we saw with the Liberators. In this case, though, he's actually directly referencing the control characteristic itself, which is good. I'm glad that they went that way. And so when you're rolling this die, you roll a die for each target. You want to roll higher than their control characteristic to give them strike last for the rest of the turn. So if they have, like, obviously the lowest control characteristic we've seen for anyone is 1. That's just a normal infantry model. So that means 5. He's got a 5 out of 6 chance that he's giving them strike last. Great. Against a unit that has a control characteristic of 2, which is common for things with a wounds characteristic of 5 or more and aren't monsters, then he's doing it on a 3+. So 4 out of every 6. So 2/3 of the time. And then the only other control characteristics we've really seen have been 5 for monsters, and he's an example of that with a control of 5 here. So it's only going off if he rolls a 6 because he has to beat it. So 1 out of every 6 times. And then we've also seen 10 for Nagash's War Scroll. That's kind of an exception. And then the Ogre monsters, they're on 5s as well. 10s as well. I think their regular heroes are on 5, so they would function like monsters in that sense. And then Kragnos we've seen at 15. So it's not possible against anything with a 6 or higher control value. But fortunately, that's not that many different things. So even though it's not that likely you're going to be giving it to a monster you're in combat with, it's still possible. Now, what it used to do is this ability would subtract one from the bravery of every unit that he was in combat with, so not just three. And that could be stacked over the course of the game. So he was just eating away at their bravery score. But of course, we don't have bravery anymore. We don't have battle shock anymore. So they had to come up with another way to interact with this. And I find it kind of interesting that it interacts with the thing that used to sit in that same place on the wheel, which was your bravery characteristic. That said, you were rolling 2d6, and you had to also beat their bravery characteristic to give them strike last. Now, this is kind of a push and pull trade-off. Some interactions are going to be better, some are worse. So one that's worse, of course, is if you're against a Gargant, it's never going off. You're never giving them strike last, because they, nowadays, with the control value, assuming they have at least as much as Kragnos has, as 15, then you're never making them fight last, because you couldn't possibly do that on a single dice. And before, they had like a bravery 7 or 8, something like that. So it was possible on 2d6 for sure. So that's something it's not going to happen against. Another thing you're never going to see it, or you're not going to see it happening as much against, are heroes that are on monsters but that formerly had bad bravery values. So say a hero on a monster, which would have a control value 5 now, and only going off 1 out of 6 of the attempts. Let's say they had a bravery of 7. Well, there was actually a much better chance than 1 out of 6 that you were going to beat their bravery on 2d6. But, so that got worse. But conversely, say you were playing against an infantry demon unit, like let's say Pink Horrors, that only count as control score 1, but used to have, like all demons or undead models pretty much, had a bravery of 10. Well, now it's going off 5 out of 6 times, but before you had to beat a 10. Means I think that's a 3 out of 36 chance, so 1 out of 12 chance. So against those kinds of units, it's gotten buffed. So it really depends on who you're going against, and I still think it's very strong. Let's put it that way. And it's happening every single turn, not just in your own. So solid. All right. So if we're looking at this Epicenter of Delusion ability, this is what I was kind of referencing before, that is the only way you get access to the old rules that we used to have. So if you look here, in your hero phase, you get to pick one of the following effects to apply until the start of your next turn. So basically for the whole battle round, unless you get doubled or whatever, that kind of wording that we're used to seeing. And these are all the same except for we lost the one that was probably the strongest, which made it so that you got Feeding Frenzy off if a hero had 4 Noble Deeds points instead of 6, which was a huge buff, and that was a common one that you would just take all the time, or you would pick something else and then have Ushoran add the other one on, because Ushoran's version of this ability before used to let you stack a different version of these Courts of Delusion on, so you could have 2 going on at any one point, and you'd have one that was fixed and then one that was flexible, kind of like what you see with the Lumineth rules right now, for which facet of war they're using. But anyway, that's gone, but at least he's bringing those rules with him if you take him, which makes him more auto-take, in my opinion. Really depends on his points value, as with all things. But if we look at what he does, the first 3 do the same exact thing they always did. The Royal Hunt is +1 to wound rolls for attacks made by Flesh Eater Courts units that target a monster. Now, as far as I'm aware, this won't apply to your monsters, because the monsters' attacks themselves are companions, and as we know, unless it says otherwise, it doesn't affect it. So this is only going to be for the riders. But I think before that did actually affect the companions, so this is probably a nerf. But adding +1, the next one, Crusading Army, adding +1 to run and charge rolls applies to the War Scroll regardless of the companion, because the companion rule only kicks in for things that impact the attacks sequence, the attacks and then the actual fighting or shooting sequence itself. So this would impact those units. So +1 to run and charge, so it's exactly the same as it was before. The next one, Defenders of the Realm, is +1 to save rolls for Flesh Eater Courts units while they're contesting an objective you control, keeping in mind that you don't actually, at least in 3rd edition parlance, you don't actually control an objective until it's been checked for at either the start of the game after deployment or after like the end of the turn, then you gain control of an objective. So assuming that's still the same in 4th edition, then that first turn, you're just because you've got more guys on the objective and they're contesting it, they wouldn't benefit from this until it's checked to see if you've gained control of that objective. I'm pretty sure that's how that's probably still going to work. But this would also, of course, apply to your companions because it's still just your save roll, and that has nothing to do with the attack profile. The next one, the Grand Tournament, is the one that was changed, notably. It's add +1 or 1 to hit rolls for attacks made by other friendly Flesh Eater Quartz heroes if they charge. Now, this used to say any Flesh Eater Quartz heroes that are not your general. Now, this kind of works about the same with him because he's a War Master, which kind of makes him a general. But in this case, it does impact your other generals in your army if you have more than one. Because it's just the only one it doesn't impact is him. So it's still pretty good, I would say. And just losing that last one that gave the feeding frenzy on 4 or less, or 4 or more noble deeds points. That's pretty rough. But otherwise, I think this is really strong because you didn't really lose that much if you take Ushoran in your list. You lost the stacking of 2 of these, of course, but I still think it's pretty good. And then let's look at his spell. I actually am looking at this for the first time because I failed to write it down in my notes. So we're going to look at it together. Casting value 7. Pick a visible enemy model, not unit, within 18 inches to be the target, and pick another enemy unit within the target's combat range to be the victim. So, and then you make a casting roll 2d6. So already I'm remembering how this used to work. I'm pretty sure this is basically the same thing. But it says pick one of the target's melee weapons, immediately resolve combat attacks made with that weapon against the victim. So if I'm just quickly looking at it, same casting value, same range. You picked a model, 1 melee weapon. Pick one other enemy unit within range of that weapon. Well, this has gotten better because combat range is now, as we know, 3 inches instead of whatever the weapon range was before. So it's definitely gotten better in that sense. In that model, enemy model immediately makes combat attacks with a weapon targeting the other enemy unit without a pile-in. But of course, now that's not a problem because everyone's got 3-inch range. So if you're in combat range, you're in range to do it. So it got a little bit buffed, I guess. And actually, I'm going to say it got a lot buffed because now you can do it twice. You can do it in your hero phase, and then you could do it with magical intervention in the opponent's turn and make them fight. In the hero phase, which would not be before they got a chance to get out of combat. So I think this actually got buffed. Now, something Ushoran did lose is he had an ability to allow himself to heal 2d3 wounds back in your hero phase. But if you keep in mind, that's only gotten cut in half. It's not totally gone because he does have the Abhorrant keyword. And then if you look back at what I said, this new kind of semi-heroic action thing, in your hero phase, which is the same timing, you get to heal D3 to each of your abhorrents. So he's getting half as much healing as he used to have because he's implicitly one of those. So ultimately, I think Ushoran only got buffed, really, in the grand scheme of the kinds of nerfs we've seen in the 4th edition indexes. So if I were playing with Ushoran or bought this beautiful model, I would be psyched that he feels a little bit more auto-takey or necessary for what he brings to the table. So I'm pretty positive on this. I'd be curious to see what you guys think and what Nick and Jonas think. All right. So let's move down to Bone Daddy himself, and I say he's the Bone Daddy, not Nagash, because he gives you a bone. He's a bone baby, maybe. That's getting maybe a little too insinuative. But all right, so the Marrowscroll Herald, this is one of the newer models that they've had. So as far as I'm concerned or aware, his stats wheel is the same. And his attacks profile, he got -1 to hit. So he did get a little nerfed in combat, and he does want to be in combat, so that is something. Sometimes with these heroes, they're not really getting in combat, so seeing a slight nerf or buff to their melee profile often is less impactful than it might seem on paper. Now, he still has a 6+ ward, and all this stuff is the same. Let's look at Don't Shoot the Messenger. This is his not getting targeted rule that he always had. It says, while this unit is not in combat, now I can tell you right now that didn't used to be the wording before. So if you get in combat with this guy, this gets turned off and then you can target him. and is wholly within the combat ranges of 3 or more friendly Flesh Eater Courts infantry models. It is not visible to enemy units. Now, how this used to work, it was wholly within, if I'm not mistaken, 6 inches of Flesh Eater Courts models. It did not specify that they were infantry, so your like cavalry units are not going to do this. But one thing that did change is this. So the range got cut in half because combat range is implicitly 3, and it used to be 6. But this number right here used to say 5. So that got cut down to just 3. But then infantry got added in. So I do think this got nerfed a bit because the range got tighter. It's now specific to infantry units, and he can't be in combat. But it is 3 models, so that got a little bit better. So it's a little bit of a side grade, but I think mostly this guy's still benefiting from this rule 9 times out of 10. So I don't see it as a hard nerf. And then he's got his Giving a Bone ability. So this is another example of an ability that used to say at the end of the charge phase and now doesn't specify, which makes me think a lot of these abilities have to happen at the end of that phase. Those of you out there that are keeping up on how combat abilities work, this is maybe an exception in that they happen before fighting happens. So all of the combat versions of an ability, combat phase versions, are happening before you actually even fight. But otherwise, it seems like a lot of these rules are happening at the end. Maybe someone has heard something said in one of the interviews or in an article and I'm just forgetting about it. So let me know, and if you could give me a reference to where you saw it. Okay, so here you're picking an enemy unit in combat to be the target, and now it doesn't go off automatically. So this is nerfed in that sense because it's on a 3-up. And then you apply one of the following effects. One of them is that friendly units, friendly Flesh Eater Courts units in combat with the target have strike first for the rest of the turn. So this means that any Flesh Eater Courts units that are within even just one model that's within 3 inches of the target enemy unit that you picked, they're going to get strike first on this 3+. For the rest of the turn, even against a different target. They don't even have to get strike first and then put all their attacks into the target that's chosen, but that's how it always worked. So not really a buff there. And then the other ability is the target has the infected keyword for the rest of the battle, and each time that target tries to use a command, a spell ability, or a prayer ability on a 5-up, they basically lose that ability. The spell or prayer fails, or the command ability, the command has no effect, and they lose the command point and they don't get it back. So how this used to work is the target used to have a choice. So the choice mechanic has been kind of replaced with this 3-up. So your opponent used to get to say, well, which one of these is the worst of the two, and I'll choose the lesser of two evils. Now they don't have a choice anymore. You get to be the chooser, but you only get it to go off on a 3-up on a d6. So I don't know if people out there think that is a side grade or as a buff. I guess it depends on what you think is, benefits your type of play style better, having the choice, or having having them have the choice, or you having some amount of randomness of whether it goes off or not. And then the other thing, if I'm not mistaken about this, was yes, when on this ability down here, it now goes off on a 5-up once they're infected. Every time they want to use one of those abilities, it used to be that you'd roll 2d6 and then it had to be braver than that target's bravery. Now, you had some bravery debuff stuff in this army, notably the Ushoran ability that we talked about earlier that's no longer there. But bravery is not here anymore. And so whether something going off 1/3 of the time, which is what a 5-up is better than trying to make a bravery roll depends on what their bravery was before. So if they were a demon or undead unit that had a bravery of 10, a 5-up is actually better than having to roll an 11 or 12. So it depends. But I still think this is cool that he's got this ability, and then this thing goes off all the time. So there's a part of me that thinks, because as long as you get this 3-up, which is true of both of these abilities, this is the one that you go with more often, because then this one is highly dependent on this 5-up roll. So I don't know. I'd be curious to see what you guys think. But ultimately, I think he's still pretty solid and has some value in the army, especially considering if you made him your general, there's a good chance they can't just shoot the guy off the table. So for that, I forget what it's called, but the battle tactic that's about killing someone in the general's regiment. If he's the only thing in the regiment, then this makes it even harder. So Definitely some strategy with this guy, and I think he definitely brings some value. All right, Crypt Guard. This was our unit, also a new unit, if I'm not mistaken, that acts as kind of a bodyguard for your heroes. So if we're looking at their profile, their save got worse. So this is a wah-wah. They went down from a 5-up save to a 6-up. So that's twice as much, or twice as bad, basically. That said, they did get +1 attack, but they got -1 to both hit and wound, which comes out to a net debuff to their output. So you're not taking these guys for their output or for their durability, unfortunately. But what they are offering really is this Royal Bodyguard rule. So let's take a look at this. It says, while any friendly Flesh Eater Court's heroes are wholly within this unit's combat range, so 3 inches, both this unit and those heroes have ward 5+ instead of what they probably on their war scroll have. These guys definitely have a 6, and then it goes up to a 5 for a hero if they don't already have it. Now, this has gotten nerfed because this unit used to have the 5+ ward no matter what. They didn't have to have a hero standing wholly within 3 inches. That range was always the 3 inches, so that hasn't changed. And the effect for the hero hasn't changed. So it's only that these guys, their save has gotten worse. So they basically are going from having a 5-up save with an always 5+ ward to now having a conditional 5+ ward with an always 6+ save. So their durability definitely got hit and their output got hit. But I think they were bringing so much value to keeping your heroes alive that it's still a very useful unit, especially if they got a little cheaper and then you can take some more of them to help protect those heroes. And then let's look at this one reaction to a fight ability. If any damage points were inflicted by attacks made as part of that fight ability are allocated to any enemy units, those enemy units cannot use commands until the start of your next turn. This has gotten a buff because it used to say until the end of this turn, which means if they have the next turn and or double you, then this is staying on for quite a while, as long as you are able to do any damage points. Now that's also a question because their output got slightly reduced. That said, if you can get through and do any amount of wounds to those enemy units, you're really messing them up. And this works even if you split your attacks. As far as the way I'm reading it right now, if you had a big unit of Crypt Guard and you were in combat with 2 different units, you could split those attacks and then have this ability go off on both of those units. You don't have to choose one because it says any enemy units, plural. So could be really strong, especially if you have a feeling that they're going to be doubling you or at least taking the next turn. Now, obviously, if you take the next turn, so you take a double, or this was happening at the opponent's last turn, then it resets and you've got to trigger it again. But still, I think it's decent. And given the bodyguard kind of rule that they've got going on, I still think this unit's worth taking. They're just a little easier to get rid of to take that bodyguard away. But obviously, they want to be standing around that hero anyway. So that 5+ ward is probably on them from the get-go as long as you don't kill that hero. So it kind of works both ways. They're buffing the hero, and the heroes are making them a little tankier. So hopefully people still feel like they're a good unit. All right, we got our first example of a monster here. And this is actually our first example of a monster that's just a, companion. What do I mean by that? Well, Kragnos is obviously a monster, but he's a thinking god, right? Like, he's got a mind for himself. He's not just a beast. And as far as I'm concerned, any of the war scrolls we've seen that are monster profiles have always had a hero on top, or have been the hero themselves, like Ushoran or Kragnos. And therefore they had no companion, or at least a writer that didn't have the companion keyword. But this is our first monster, and it's got the companion keyword written all over it, including its shooting attacks. This is not how things used to work in AOS 3, because the only place that this kind of companion rule really came into play was with artifacts or command traits, where there was a rule written in the core rules that basically said, if there's a buff that's applied to friendly units, say your general's got a command trait that gives +1 to hit for all units wholly than 12 of them. It wouldn't say it on the command trait itself, but in the core rules it would say if that unit had the mount keyword or was companion or crew or whatever, they did not benefit from those abilities unless it said otherwise. But what this did mean was, so let's say you had your general had that ability, and then you had like a guy riding a mount, and that guy riding the mount that was a different unit, or even the general himself, would be within that bubble and receiving that bonus. The guy riding it would get the buff, but not the mount, okay? But let's say that there was a generic version of that mount, like in this case, instead of an Abhorrant, Ghoul King, or whatever they're called, riding a Royal Zombie Dragon, it was just the Royal Zombie Dragon by itself, and it was in that bubble. Because it didn't have the mount keyword, because it was its own unit, it got to benefit from the rules, because there was no distinction between a smarter rider and the dumber mount, because it was just the monster. But now, evidently, they've gone and said, well, in these cases where there is no rider, but it is still a dumb monster, they have this companion keyword on everything. So that means they're not going to benefit from any of these types of abilities. Now, things that it will impact are all-out attack, all-out defense. They said that on the command abilities themselves, that it does apply to companions. And the second thing that it does apply to, very importantly in this army, is that the Feeding Frenzy +1 attack rule does impact the companions. So that's good. Things it doesn't do is trigger the extra noble deed points. But of course that makes no sense here because this is not a hero. We can look down here and see that it's just a monster. Okay? All right. So just seeing as this is our first time we've seen this in action, thought I'd go ahead and explain kind of that little difference and how it's changed. Now, if we look at what's changed here, its movement characteristic is down 2 inches from its best profile, so its unwounded profile in 3.0, but it's equivalent to and doesn't get any worse than its second best profile. And some people, I know, I listened to Haywo's commentary on the ogres, them getting slower, and I get why he was saying that, but for most situations, I would rather my monster be on its second best bracket and never be able to get bracketed on movement, down to like 4 inches or 6 inches or something, and then just starting on like a little bit worse than it ever was, like on its best bracket, than the other way around. But in his situation, they got double hit because the ogres are also not getting +2 to movement characteristic when they're hungry. Anyway, so that got worse. And then if we look at the rest of this looks identical. So the shooting weapon does have shooting combat, which I'm glad to see, and it makes sense for something like a pestilential breath. It's just kind of like, doing its flame attack, essentially. It lost 2 inches of range, but otherwise got +1 to hit, -1 to wound, which is a small difference in output. It's a difference between 16/36 if you're at 3s and 3s to now you're at 15/36 is what you would multiply by the attacks, whatever you roll in the attacks, or the average being 3.5, and then times the damage. So it's a very small difference, but it is a nerf. It's a little bit of a nerf, especially given the range reduction. But you don't take this unit for its shooting anyway, and fortunately, it can still shoot in combat. Then we are looking at the Maw. So this was always 3 attacks. It was always on 4s, and now it's got +1 to wound, which thank God, because these units really struggled to kind of get some of their best profiles out. And being on 2-ups to wound is great. It did lose a pip of rend, but honestly, I personally would take the +1 to wound over the difference between a -2 or -3 rend, especially considering things don't have as good save stacking anymore. So I think that actually is a net buff, and it still has the same damage. And keep in mind, it still has Feeding Frenzy, which the rend is the last thing that cuts in. And I would rather have more stuff go through than not. And remember, this can still take an all-out attack and could go up to 4 attacks with Feeding Frenzy. Draconic Claws does get bracketed. It always got bracketed before, but it's starting on its best profile. So it's not bracketed with this fixed profile, and it only goes down to the second worst profile if it takes 10 or more wounds. So try not to let it take 10 or more wounds. And it also has a +1 to wound, and the rest of the profile is identical. So ultimately, big buffs for the damage output for the Royal Zombie Dragon when it's by itself, and I'm assuming it has the same profile when it's being ridden by one of the guys. Okay, so these two rules are just what we're seeing whenever you get a deep strike thing. There's a deployment version where you set it in reserve, and then how you set it up on the table, and that's identical to what it used to be, if I'm not mistaken. And then we've got its Rampage. Once per turn, army, any combat phase. So assuming this doesn't stack with other Royal Zombie Dragons, but we'll have to see if the ridden version has the same one. Let's assume for now it does, so you're only getting this off once. If this unit charged this turn, roll a die on a 3-up. This unit can move 2d6 inches and can pass through the combat ranges of enemy units but must end in combat. Then pick an enemy unit that it passed over during the move, inflict d3 mortal damage on that enemy unit. This is rough seeing if I were an ogre player looking at this right now, because this is like a light version of what the kind of really good move that they had, like the monstrous rampage that they had. I think it moved 3d6 if I'm not mistaken for the ogres, but it was at least 2d6. And they did more wounds against at least one of the units you flew over, if not multiple. I don't have it. I don't know it off the top of my head. But this is still better. It's still something, right? Now, it goes off on a 3-up, which is kind of our regular rampage success or fail roll that we've typically seen with, say, Roar. But in any case, this is a great ability and has lots of flexibility. So I'm assuming the Royal Zombie Dragon, because of its deep strike capability, its improved profile, of course, but also especially this Roar, or this Rampage, I should say, is kind of the move. It's the flexible, tactical, techie option for your monster between the two. I'm assuming the Terrorgeist is going to be more traditionally just get in and fuck some shit up, right? But this is fantastic for stealing an objective or changing the opponents you're fighting or moving out of the combat range of something that's going to be in combat with you, especially given the 3-inch combat range that everyone has now. So we all know that you can't pile in you can't pull yourself totally outside of range of anyone you started combat with. But this would actually allow that. So say that one of the targets you're in combat with is something you're scared of, and you've got another target. You could just move to a totally different unit, get the hell out of dodge, and then go, beat up on something that you've got a much better chance in against, or steal an objective, like I said. So I actually think this unit stonks went up a good bit, especially if the Rider version has something similar. Okay, and so then we just go on to the Morbeg Knight's War Scroll. I'll just keep in mind this is a Spearhead War Scroll, so it's not too reliable what it's going to be or isn't going to be, but it's looking good. They got a +1 on their health characteristic, which I'm assuming sticks, which is even better. And these models are so fantastic. You got to love it. I don't know if this is the first time we've seen a ward written down here on a Spearhead War Scroll, but it's definitely a good sign for the Death players that are going to be playing Spearhead. And of course, we'd expect to see this ward on the regular version of the game's War Scroll anyway. Looking at the Lance, so we're getting 2 attacks, 3s and 4s, so that's -1 from the wound score from what we used to see. -1 still, and then 1 damage, but on the charge, this is also kind of rare for a Spearhead War Scroll. It's got an ability here. It's getting +1 damage on the charge, which means even though it got hit with this, it's actually coming out with a buff for the Riders from what it used to do in terms of the Lance itself. Now, coming back to that, they also used to do impact hits. On a 4-up, you'd roll for each model, and then it would do D3 mortal wounds for each 4-up. So we have no idea whether that's still on the actual War Scroll, but it's not here for the Spearhead, which is totally fine for Spearhead, especially considering this is a decent output, a decent profile for output here. But I kind of have the feeling this will stay. So if this does stay and they're still doing the mortal wounds, they're looking pretty good, especially with the extra health. Looking at the mount itself, it still has 3 attacks. It's on 4s and 3s instead of 3s and 3s, so it lost a pip of hit, or a point to hit there, and then -1, 2. So it's basically got nerfed a little bit. So what did it used to have? It had the retreat and charge, which is basically what it has here, and they added the wording that it doesn't suffer damage when it does that, so that's good. That I'm assuming something like that will still be on the official War Scroll. It did lose, however, the turning off Unleash Hell, which we don't really have Unleash Hell, but so I guess that's not so bad. But losing the mortal wounds is pretty rough. And then it lost counting as more bodies on objectives if it's got a standard bearer, and we know that that's not what I guess a standard bearer does give you +1 to your control score, if I'm not mistaken. It's either that or the musician. So it's kind of doing that, but maybe that rule fell off the regular War Scroll. So we'll see. But this is, even for a Spearhead War Scroll, this is looking like an upgrade for the Knights in general, especially considering Unleash Hell is gone. It just really depends on whether or not the mortal wounds on the charge are still a thing. But overall, I think FEC players should be happy. Like, I think there's enough actual legitimate buffs here. So that's one positive reason to be happy. Like actual buffs to some of these units. Especially this maybe what's happening with the Knights, definitely what's going on with the Royal Zombie Dragon. And then another thing that's not so bad is seeing that a lot of your rules either stayed the same or only got slightly nerfed, like kind of got pulled out a little bit. But mostly we're seeing that these things are doing what we expected them to do and sometimes have even better usability in some cases. As a FEC player, I would be pretty happy considering what other people are receiving in these indexes. So you guys, let me know what you're thinking. It's a bummer we didn't have Jonas here, and sorry if I'm just rambling here, but hopefully you guys get something out of this. And I'm really excited to see what the rest of the death indexes look like, especially Soulblight. Very curious about Soulblight because I feel like they're going to have lost something. I'm just bracing for impact for all my Soulblight buddies that are really passionate about each one of the 5 different like legions of whatever they've got and dynasties, and that they might be losing some of that flavor considering what they did to cities. So we'll see soon enough, but we know that next week's first index is Fire Slayers, which I'm really psyched about because I'm hoping they finally get some rules that make them feel like they've got a little bit more movement shenanigans and some tricks up their sleeve while we wait for them to maybe get a range addition in expansions such as like mini Droths or something else that makes them not just feel like Hero Hammer or the same looking dudes. So anyway, looking forward to that one, and we'll try to get that video out as soon as we can after the Monday release. But until that time, guys, hit us up in all the channels and keep in touch with us. Let us know what you think of this FEC review and what's going on with the FEC news. And until next time, Ryan out.